And press record. Okay. How's everybody doing today? On this very cold, frosty Wednesday morning. I am so excited you're here today. For those of you who I haven't met before, I am Dr. Allison Boyer. I'm director of the Center for Teaching and Learning here at Collin College. And I'm looking forward to spending a little time with you today to talk about how we might encourage our students to complete readings and just generally prepare for our classes a little more effectively. I imagine we're all here today because we really want our students to prepare so diligently for our classes, but we're often disappointed in their preparation. And a lot of times we might not even expect our students to do it anymore. We just kind of come to class with the expectation that they probably won't have read what we want them to have read or done the homework or things like that. So we're going to talk about some of that today. And for what it's worth, research does actually confirm that this thing that we might already suspect and observe in our own classes, that relatively few students do actually complete the reading that's assigned to them. And for what it's worth, it seems that fewer adults in general are reading, whether for learning or simply for enjoyment, which makes me really sad, because reading is a good thing and it's an important thing. So before we get started, I want us to pause for a minute of some self-reflection. So I would like all of you to think on a time when maybe you did not finish a book, whether it was something that was assigned to you or even something that you had picked up to read for pleasure at any point in your life, as an adult, as a teenager, whatever. Or maybe you didn't complete an assignment, some homework, something like that. Okay, so y'all have something in mind now, I hope. Now, why didn't you complete it? If you could think about that and maybe put some of your ideas in the chat so that we could all see. Why didn't you finish that book or that assignment? What was it that got in the way? Other priorities, absolutely. Didn't hold your interest, ran out of time. Just reading what you needed to read, right? It was due back at the library. Didn't know exactly what to do. Yeah, that's a really important one. Got distracted. A 50-page rule. If it didn't capture me by then, I don't finish it. I like that rule, Mindy. I know that I've stuck it out with books that I didn't really enjoy for far too long, just because I felt obligated. I had started it, I need to finish it. Anything else that we haven't touched on yet? So we're hearing about time limits, lack of interest, not getting hooked on it, other priorities or distractions, other class homework getting in the way for sure, right? This list of obligations that we have to do, that you have to prioritize in some way, for sure. And I think someone else had said, and wasn't exactly sure what to do, right? So this is something that we're not immune to. I mean, we're here, we're academics, we're here because we like reading, we like studying, we like our field of study. But even we have had a book or two that we haven't finished or an assignment that we didn't complete. So before we can figure out how to encourage our students to prepare, it's helpful for us to think about why they don't prepare. And as our own personal reflections have just showed, we likely have had some of this very same feelings and experiences that our students have. And like I said earlier, we've made, going to school basically our careers, right? We've signed up for this. So here's what the research tells us about why students don't read or don't prepare. First of all, they have poor reading skills in a lot of cases. Research and experience suggests that our current college students are really not as proficient at reading as we might expect them to be by the time they get to our classes. And while they obviously know how to read in the most basic sense, they likely need help learning how to read closely and analytically rather than superficially. And, we're all experienced academics here, so we know that deep reading, right, really close reading takes time and it takes effort. It's not an easy thing to do. So imagine how much harder it is for students who haven't been trained in that and who don't have experience with that. And our students might even be, quote unquote, doing the reading or doing the preparation, or believe they're doing the reading because, the words pass in front of their eyes at some point. They've seen the words, but maybe they're not absorbing it and processing it the way we want them to, or engaging with the text or the homework in the way that we want them to. And quite frankly, what's happening is that a lot of instructors are becoming prone to kind of repeating the information in class because they want to help their students learn the information, obviously, which is a great thing. However, that can be creating this kind of vicious cycle, right? We repeat the text because our students didn't read the text and we need them to know that information in order to move forward. But we're also depriving our students of the very practice and challenges that they need in order to be able to complete the reading in the first place. So in other words, our students don't read well, so we explain it for them, so they don't learn to read well, and they don't do the reading, so we continue to explain it for them, and so on and so forth. This kind of vicious cycle continues. So we're kind of depriving our students of building that skill that they might need. The second piece of this is overall low feelings of self-efficacy on our students' behalf. A lack of self-confidence might play a role in their lack of compliance in terms of preparing for class. Some of you may already be familiar with the work of Carol Dweck on this idea of mindset, suggesting that students with a fixed theory of intelligence, i.e., academic challenges are a result of being dumb, right? An unchangeable state of being. And they might perhaps, if our students see themselves in that way, if they have that particular mindset, they might avoid those difficult tasks because the challenge to them feels insurmountable, regardless of effort or value. This kind of, why should I bother? I'm not going to be able to do it anyway. And I have seen this in action with my own students. And it's very challenging. So even if they know that the reading and preparation is really important, they might simply feel like they can't succeed. So as a result, they don't bother trying, right? Here's another piece, unclear value. They might not do the reading or the homework because they don't see the value in it. They don't know why it's important or why we're asking them to do it in the first place. A lot of the literature reports that our students see the instructor's lecture as the really most important piece in terms of sources of information, or they might not see a connection between the reading they're doing out of class and their academic success. And so they choose to rely solely on class attendance, to get all of the information that they feel they need and opt out of doing the readings. And sometimes when we give them our slides or other handouts, which isn't necessarily a bad practice, there are a lot of benefits to that, but it can potentially exacerbate this problem for our students, right? They might see the reading then as unnecessary busy work because, again, they feel like, oh, the instructor's just going to give me everything I need, so why should I waste my time on that, right? especially if they have other obligations. And then here's this last piece that a lot of you already mentioned, this lack of intrinsic interest. One reason they might not want to spend time outside of class preparing is that, quite frankly, they are just not as excited about the topic as we are, right? We've cultivated years of learning and research in our own disciplines because we have some sort of innate attraction to them. While our students may simply be taking our class because they're required to for some reason. And there have been studies that show there are higher rates of compliance in higher level courses due potentially to those students' intrinsic interests in the subject, right? That's a higher level course, they're electing to take it rather than those kind of core required courses that a lot of us teach. And so they're more interested in the matter, in the material for the course. And so it's their chosen course of study, right? So it follows then that our students might be less motivated to do the work that we ask them to do the reading, simply because they don't share our enthusiasm for the material, or at least they haven't acquired that enthusiasm yet, right? And given the many demands on our students' time and attention, whether those are things like jobs, families, sleeping, getting exercise, or even things like, social media, looking at Twitter or Snapchat or whatever it is the kids do these days that I don't know about. That's more alluring to them than spending a few hours reading a text or completing an assignment that they just aren't interested in and maybe don't see the value in. So let's pause again and reflect on this. So why do we want our students to complete readings or other preparation before class? Why do we assign it at all if we have all of these reasons that they're not going to do it? So what do you all think? When you assign students a task, homework or something like that they need to do, why are you doing that? What's your rationale? Being prepared is a life skill, absolutely. Thank you, Melissa. For a better learning result, yes. How does students outside of classwork help them get that better learning result? Prime them for vocabulary use, so giving them knowledge so they can practice together in class, encoding information, yes, absolutely. Safety purposes for the lab, yes, that's really important. Feel more confident in their knowledge base, that's a great one. To prepare them for their future and for their job, absolutely. Training them to think analytically. If it's a literature class, they have to read it, right? Otherwise you can't discuss it in class. Flipped classrooms, joining a conversation. Because the reading is essential to understanding the topic before they begin to apply what they've read. Yes, absolutely, Diana. Developing those necessary skills. Right, so we have all kinds of great reasons that we're asking them to do these things. It's not just busy work to us. We have very good rationale. We realize that this is a really important part of the learning process. Perhaps we need text to help cover material that we can't spend the time on in class. We want them to have some exposure to the content so that during class, we can dive into it more deeply, that we can learn how to analyze it, apply that information together. Simple safety practices, if we're teaching a lab, right? Things that they need to know before they even set foot in the classroom. If they come to class unfamiliar with the material at all, they can't do anything with it once they get to class. So there are kind of two different camps, so to speak, of how we can help encourage our students to come to class prepared. We have this complex system of influences that are at work, kind of demotivating our students. So there are a lot of different ways that we can come at them and try to remotivate them, I guess, to complete the things that we want them to do to be more prepared. So there are some purely extrinsic motivational tactics that we can use, but then there are also some strategies that we can use to hopefully provide some more intrinsic motivation for our students. And before we talk about these, I just kind of want to give the caveat that not every strategy will work for every instructor's needs, class logistics, teaching philosophies, what have you. But hopefully there will be something amongst some of the things that we talk about today that will be helpful, or something that you can adapt to meet your own needs. So let's start by looking at some extrinsic motivational strategies. This idea of kind of compelling our students to prepare in some way. Things that offer some kind of external reward or punishment for our students if they don't prepare or don't read. I will say that this idea of extrinsic motivation is often controversial in the field of teaching and learning. There are a lot of pluses and minuses to it, I think. Supporters will argue that they are really effective in providing tangible consequences for students. They're also often pretty easy to implement. They are logistically feasible, and they work, right? They're effective. But there are also detractors that will argue that they serve to undermine this rather than foster a student's love of learning, and thus are ultimately kind of in the big picture demotivating to their long-term learning processes. But that said, they still remain a popular and easily implemented strategy for a lot of people, and are viable, right? It's okay. Then there are ways to do them successfully and effectively without necessarily making them feel like punishment to your students. So first and foremost, perhaps the kind of the go-to strategy is the reading quiz. In fact, I was talking to my husband last night. He was asking me, so what's your session about tomorrow? And I said, well, getting students to read. And he's like, well, how do you do that besides giving them quizzes? I'm like, actually, there are a lot of ways, but quizzes are popular. So obviously there are a lot of different ways that you can give quizzes or other kinds of assessments. Whether they're announced in advance, students know when they're coming, or whether they're pop quizzes. They really do offer a lot of items in the, kind of the plus column when it comes to motivating our students. They are absolutely, certainly effective in providing incentive for our students because they can directly affect a student's final course grade and are within our control to a certain degree, including our students. They can also offer a pretty low stakes, easy, good grade to those students who are well prepared. So in that sense, it can be a real bonus for our students and, an easy way to get a good grade. Something that I thought was interesting, there's one study that found that required and announced techniques rather than pop quizzes were rated more highly by students than an optional or unannounced quiz, right? They don't like pop quizzes. So in other words, the students admitted that these techniques worked. They got them to read, and they appreciated knowing about them in advance, right? Which I guess shouldn't be surprising. Nobody really likes a pop quiz. And again, they can be really easily implemented. And if you're teaching online or using Canvas or something like that, they can even be graded automatically. So it's easy for you, easy for your students, regardless of class size. But again, quizzes in particular, while effective, are not particularly well liked by students. Even though they admit that they're effective in getting them to read, students generally don't like them. And many view them, again, they view them as punitive, which we may or may not like. But if you do want to use quizzes in your classroom, and this is absolutely something that I've done in my own classroom, here are a few ideas for doing it effectively in terms of student motivation as well as learning. So first, kind of think beyond multiple choice. Multiple choice is okay, but you might try weaving in some other kinds of questions that might help them move beyond surface learning, maybe short answer questions, or a mini essay question that asks them to explain their initial understanding of a concept, or kind of start to engage in lower level analysis. But I would also argue there's also a benefit to some kind of basic surface learning things too, if you just want to make sure that they've completed a reading in some sense. So, but you might think beyond just multiple choice. Yeah, and Mindy is saying it's important to keep quizzes low stakes retrieval practice so that stress level is mitigated. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, I know that when I've done reading quizzes with my own students, I've kept them very simple, just like I was teaching literature classes, so it would be a question like, so what happened to this character at the end of the book? Or who is so-and-so's sister, or things like that. Because again, it's just kind of like a check mark for them and a check mark for me, knowing that they completed it. Another great strategy is to offer them multiple attempts at completion, especially easy to do if it's an online quiz. Because again, the idea is for them to learn, right? And if they're able to keep taking the quiz until they've learned it, and not just memorized it. So maybe it's not the exact same questions every time, but questions that get at similar material, then they can learn the material and still it's low stakes to them because they're able to take it a few times. Sometimes you can give them unlimited amounts. You can also say you can take the quiz 3 times and we'll take your best score. It's really up to you. I see Mindy in the chat here is saying she allows 10 attempts and takes their highest grade so that they get repetition and move material to long-term memory. Exactly. That's exactly the idea here. I think it's also a great idea to consider allowing students to make corrections if that feels viable to you. Again, it all depends on your class size and logistics, but if you're giving them the opportunity to correct some wrong answers, then again, they're kind of getting that iterative learning process, repeating access to the information and exposure to the information and really solidifying it for them. And then last but not least, take time to review those quizzes with your students. Let them know whether it's online or in class. Spend time going over what the correct answers are so students can learn from their mistakes in some way. I think it's always surprising and kind of disappointing when students are unable to find out what they did wrong on an assessment, because I wonder how are they able to learn from that later on. So those are just a few ideas regarding quizzes. Another simple strategy that it can also be controversial because it's perhaps not always executed very effectively is this classic cold calling technique, right? Randomly calling on students to answer questions in some form or fashion during class. This can be part of a formal class participation grade. It could simply, for some people, they just rely on kind of the pressure to avoid feeling uncomfortable during class or in front of their peers. So as I mentioned, this is often controversial. It is often perceived as uncomfortable at best, or punitive or aimed at embarrassing students at worst. Neither of those are good things. We do not want that. But there is research that shows that it can be implemented in ways that incentivize preparation without that humiliation factor. And in fact, some research has also shown that this practice, when executed with care, can actually increase student comfort with class participation and preparation, and increase their willingness to prepare for class. So I guess the question here remains, how do we do that without making it feel like we're trying to put students on the spot or embarrass them in some way when we call on them? Obviously, the first key to success here is a warm and supportive environment rather than something that feels vindictive or threatening in some way. Students typically don't like feeling that they're under attack or under the microscope. And if I'm being honest with you, when I think of cold calling, the first thing that kind of pops into my mind are like all those TV shows or movies I've seen about law school. You all can probably think of a really good example yourselves where students are in class and there's this kind of rapid fire questioning that's happening and students are really being put on the spot to get the right answer. That is not warm and encouraging. That's not the tone that we want to go for here. Maybe there are rules about that's how you do it in law school, but that's not what I'm suggesting that you do here. You want to respond with encouragement and avoid negative behavior such as sarcasm. Even if you feel like you're being funny, I can say this from experience, students aren't always going to read sarcasm in a positive way. You might intend it with humor, but they might read it as mocking. So avoid that tone. Also, you want to make sure you inform your students early on in the semester or in the process, right? You're creating a norm of participation for them and let them know that, this is how things are going to happen in our class this semester. But don't be worried about it. I'm not here to attack you. This is just how we're going to have conversation during class. This way they at least know what to expect, right? We all like to know what's heading our way and don't like to be surprised by those things. It can also be beneficial to give students time to think when needed. For instance, you might allow students a minute to write in advance. You pose a question and say, okay, well, let's all think about this for a minute, maybe write down some ideas. And then I'm going to ask you to share your ideas with the class when I call on you. So in this way, they get kind of a chance to rehearse their answers a little bit and again, feel less on the spot. I know that I always like a chance to think about what I'm going to say before I say it. I like to practice a little bit, and I'm not always great at thinking on my feet. And I imagine our students feel the same way. You might even invite responses from a particular student later in class. If it's somebody who might feel uncomfortable participating or speaking, or who hasn't shared anything yet, but you really want to hear from them, you could say something like, hey, Jill, later on in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to share some of your ideas about this concept, okay? So then Jill knows that this is coming and that she's going to be on. Similarly, it can be beneficial to allow students to decline a response occasionally, right? If they're having a bad day or they're unprepared, that happens. You can kind of give them a free pass or a red flag or whatever you want to call it. But again, perhaps with limitations, maybe every student gets 3 of those for the semester and they can cash them in at a certain time when they're having a bad day or need the pressure to be off of them. You can also think about giving them second chances. Maybe they tried to answer a question or they weren't ready when you called on them earlier. So you could say, okay, think about it for a minute. We're going to come back. I'm going to ask you about that again. So again, just give them a chance to redeem themselves and emphasize this idea that this really is about learning. This isn't about me embarrassing you as a student. Randomization is another way to make it feel less like you're targeting students. It can also make sure that you're kind of staying on your toes and making sure that you spread the wealth, so to speak. And there are so many different fun ways that you can do this. to ensure that it's fair. Maybe you draw names out of a hat. Using playing cards is another fun idea, where you distribute cards to students one day in class and say, okay, I want the person who has the 3 of diamonds to respond to this question. So you don't even know who you're calling on. I've had one of my graduate students use this in her class, and she loved it and her students loved it because nobody ever felt like they were being picked on. You can use the class roster to kind of randomly pick out names. I worked with one instructor from mechanical engineering a few years ago who developed an algorithm out of his class's roster to randomly give him a student's name when he wanted to call on somebody. And again, he loved it, his students loved it. So randomizing it can be a great way. Oh, so Dustin says he cold calls in his math classes, but alphabetically. So that's a great idea. I love that. They know their name's coming up, so they can be prepared. Yeah, being math, I need to be very supportive with students. Yeah, that seems like a really great strategy, Dustin. And I'm glad to know that you are being supportive of your students while you do it. Last but not least, it is really important that you make sure that you weave in open-ended questions when you're using this strategy. Maybe not every question has to be, but if you are making sure that at least some of your questions are open-ended with a multitude of possible responses, that makes it so that when you're cold calling, it doesn't feel like it's always a pop quiz with the possibility of a wrong answer, right? It's going to feel more inviting because there are many different answers that could be right regarding that question. And that's just a good strategy in general, I think, when you're trying to facilitate discussion in your class, for instance. All right. So another strategy might be to provide students with questions related to the reading that help guide them, things that they need to be prepared to answer or be prepared to respond to, either prior to class or during class in some way. And this can serve dual purposes, really. It not only encourages compliance because students know they're going to be accountable for something in class related to the reading, but it also can provide guidance to students as they work to complete the reading, helping them navigate the text, look for things that are important, things that they should be looking out for, foster deep reading, things like that. So in order to do this well, you need to make sure you do actually use those questions or assignments in class or give credit for them in some way, because otherwise students will just perceive them as busy work. You know, like, oh, here's a worksheet I need to complete before I go to class just so she knows that I read, right? Make it instrumental to what's happening in the class. And we're going to kind of come back to this idea later as well. It's also beneficial, I think, to, if you're going to use this strategy, give them questions or tasks that probe beyond simple terminology, because those are things that they could probably pick up from bold text or section headings if it's a textbook of sorts. Not necessarily a novel or short story, but in a textbook, that could certainly be the case. So if you want them to read a little bit more deeply, you want to give them questions or tasks that ask them to do a little bit more than simply skim the text for bold headings. An alternate version of this strategy is to ask students to provide their own discussion questions based on the reading or the assignment. This will certainly require closer reading and critical thinking. You could then use those questions during class, maybe to jumpstart your lecture or begin a discussion in some way, depending on what your course content is. This allows you to peruse their questions and responses in advance and draw on them during class. One particular strategy that I think is a really fun idea is called the QQC, which stands for question, quotation, and comment, which basically asks students while they're doing a reading to come to class next time with a question that they have about the material, a quotation that really stood out to them from the content, and then a comment or an idea that they have about the material. I have a friend who's a faculty member at another university who uses this in her classes and has had really great success with it. It's not particularly tasking on the students, but it still gets them to kind of think more deeply and holds them accountable as well. And I think when she does it, they get some kind of grade for it as well, maybe a completion grade or something like that. So that's an idea that I love. I've also known a lot of instructors who will ask their students, especially in maybe literature classes, to have some sort of reading response journal that they keep and use in class in some way. If you are teaching a more advanced class, it could even be interesting to arrange for some of your students to serve as facilitators or discussion leaders if it's something that you feel they could be prepared for. Some instructors think about using student presentations as a format for demonstrating that they've done the reading, and assigning students or groups of students to be responsible for kind of being in charge of presenting on a particular reading during the semester. Again, I think there's some kind of pluses and minuses to this particular strategy. It's certainly going to depend on your class size, because if you have a lot of students, it's going to take up a lot of class time to do this. It's obviously going to be really valuable for encouraging really close reading or deeper reading. However, it might also only ensure that the students who are responsible for the presentation that day will have done the reading and not everybody else. So some things to consider there. How are we doing at this moment? Are you all okay? Do you have any comments or questions at this point that you want to bring up before we move on to intrinsic motivation? We're good? Okay, I'm gonna keep on going then. So let's take a step back now then and think about some more intrinsically motivating strategies for our students. So if we think of extrinsic motivation as compelling our students, let's think of intrinsic motivation as inspiring our students to prepare. I think first and foremost, we need to consider helping our students just build a stronger foundation by teaching them better academic reading skills. I know some people might feel like, well, they should already know how to do this by the time they get to college classes. But, the truth is we get the students we get, and we have to meet them where they are. And since we know that their academic reading skills and general reading practices are maybe less developed than we might expect or hope them to be, it's really going to be valuable to take a little bit of time to teach our students some of those important skills, to make the reading process less daunting, to make our expectations clearer, and then hopefully make our students more inclined to oblige and come to class prepared in the way that we want them to. I think it can be especially valuable to help acquaint our students with disciplinary or general academic conventions and strategies, right? Help them learn how to read scholarly work in our disciplines. Our students might not realize that scientists and historians read texts in very different ways. Reading a scientific article requires a certain set of skills, whereas maybe reading a primary source for a history class versus reading a novel from the 18th century, those are all going to require different reading skills. So if we can help our students learn some of those strategies, then again, maybe the task won't seem as overwhelming to them, and they'll feel more able and more willing to do it. Similarly, our students might be unfamiliar with the general organization or style of an academic text. Linda Nilsson, whose book, Teaching at Its Best, if you haven't read it before, I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book with all kinds of practical tips. And she's wonderful. It's very accessible. She suggests giving students what she calls a grand tour of the text before they even begin. Working with them to identify elements such as organizing structures, maybe the thesis, how to recognize point of view in the text, kind of giving them that insider's look into how to get what you want them to get out of the text in some way, because they might not have that skill at the ready. Kind of similar to this is helping them bolster basic skills, like teaching them how to identify transitions or other verbal signals in the text, maybe comparison words, cause and effect words, illustration words, things like that. How to read those cues that we've already internalized as academics. When we see these things, we know what's coming, but our students might not. And that's something that we might take for granted in terms of helping us get through a reading or an assignment more easily. This is one that I'm particularly passionate about, and that is teaching our students how to take effective notes and how to mark their text. And then even taking time to model those strategies for our students. I think note-taking is a lost art for a lot of our students. They've become really reliant on things like PowerPoint, and they don't realize the importance that the act of note-taking has, not only to storing information, but also encoding that information for them. Again, this is a topic I could geek out on for hours, so I'm going to try to restrain myself about that right now, but helping our students realize the importance of taking notes, showing them how they can mark the text in ways when reading, summarizing information, organizing things beyond just, highlighting random things in the text. And then maybe even tell your students that these practices can be empirically linked to higher grades. That will speak their language. And if they know that this can help them get a better grade, maybe they'll be more inclined to do it. I think it can also be important to recognize that novice readers likely don't appreciate the various purposes of a text, and may not realize they're even allowed to question the text or engage with it critically in some way. They might be used to this just, I need to accept everything it says and take it at face value, when that might be not what you want them to do, right? You might want them to be questioning the text and come with some critical analysis. So if you can help them identify things like context, bias, argument, validity, all of those things might also help them prepare a little more deeply than they have been. So promoting and previewing the reading can also be of real benefit. It might help for us to think of ourselves as we're salesmen. We have to sell the text to our students in advance a little bit. Help them get interested in it in some way. Again, we already have that intrinsic enthusiasm about the material. We've chosen the text for a reason, but they don't necessarily know that. So explain the purpose, the value, the significance of the text to your students in advance. Let them know why you chose it. They won't necessarily intuit that. So this idea of transparency, I think, is a really important one in so many aspects of our teaching. And we might not think of it in terms of the text, but that too, I think, can be really important to students, and knowing that you do have a rationale for it, that it's not just, well, I assigned this text because we're supposed to have a textbook. And I'm assigning you reading because that's just what you do in a college class. No, this is why we're doing it, right? Explain that to them convey your enthusiasm for it. You know, I chose this book because it's a really great example of X, Y, Z, whatever. Sell it to them, right? Similarly, it can be worthwhile to promote the readings each day, each week. You know, okay, so this week we're going to focus on these chapters, and they're going to answer these questions for you. We've been wondering about this since the beginning of the semester. Well, this chapter is going to help provide some answers for you, and we're going to talk about it more in class, right? Some instructors might provide reading guides each week for their students. Again, back to that idea of giving them questions to think about while they're doing the reading, and some creative ideas for kind of rousing their interest in the reading. Besides reading guides, you might think about doing something like an ungraded pretest that kind of previews the content for them. Like, you know, here are a few questions. It's okay if you don't know the answers, because guess what? Next week, you will know the answers, because this is what our text is going to be about. This can also help you identify any gaps in knowledge, which can be a valuable assessment for you as well. And then explaining real-world relevance is always a great strategy and a great selling point for anything that we do in the class. Because I'm sure, as you all already know, when we can help our students understand how our course material or activities will serve them beyond the confines of our classroom, like how it's going to help them in real life, which I think somebody mentioned earlier in the chat, this can increase their motivation, because again, it's not going to feel like, well, this is busy work that I have to do just to get the grade in this class that I have to take. Instead, it's, oh, this is really going to help me when I graduate and when I try to get a job, right? You could even think about doing things like setting up a problem or a case study in advance and say, okay, so we're going to talk about this in class next time. You're going to do the reading or complete the assignment, and then we're going to work on this case study together. And that, again, kind of sets it in these real world terms for our students. So ultimately, it's just this idea of talking about the text in class can help convey the significance of the reading for our students and prepare students for the task, which is what we want to do, right? Let them know why it's important, because we know it's important. Another great strategy, I think, is this idea of offering our students some choice. This can be really motivational for students. Research has definitely supported this idea that there are benefits in providing choices to our students. It gives them a greater sense of ownership over the course material and engages them with the course material in a different way, and can improve their self-determination as well. And when they have the opportunity to make choices, they're more likely to feel interested and to value those learning activities, again, because they had a role in choosing them. So there are a lot of different ways that you can integrate choice into your classes. It might be allowing your students to select one course topic, right? Maybe you have a few different topics that you're considering for a certain week, and then you let your students choose. It could be something that the entire class votes on, or something that you allow individual students to select. In order to develop some expertise, maybe they can help facilitate a discussion on that topic for the rest of the class. Offering them this, you know, maybe a small selection of topics to choose from as a whole can earn some buy-in from the class, right? Because it was their choice, it was their determination. And kind of along similar lines, another strategy is to provide a small section of readings or activities about a certain topic from which students might choose. So again, it could be, here are 3 different articles that you could read for this particular topic. You get to choose which one you read. It might be something that you allow them to choose individually, or again, it could be something that the whole class decides on collectively. In more advanced classes, you might even be able to invite students to propose a topic or a relevant reading on their own. Again, it's going to be up to you and your discretion to decide whether that's viable for your classes or for your students. And as I've already mentioned, you could leave things up to a class vote. There is one caveat, I think, with this particular strategy, bearing in mind levels of student development here. Too much choice can overwhelm lower performing or younger students. So you kind of want to tread the line of moderation. Choice can absolutely be motivational when the task options are of appropriate difficulty, but when it comes with this structure around it, this framework that you've built for them. So kind of in the end, the goal is to give students enough freedom and ownership of the material or the task to kind of tap into their own interests and create that sense of personal meaning for them, but not so much that they feel overwhelmed or anxious or lost, right? So it's kind of choice, but with some limitations around them. So things that you've deemed appropriate for the class in terms of level and difficulty and things like that. But then again, they get a little bit of choice and sense of ownership around them. Oh, I love that, Susan, giving students choices of topics and discussion boards. That's a great example. That's perfect. It's not this huge, overwhelming choice. It's simple, but they can feel a sense of control over it. I think of it even in terms of like when, I can remember getting essay exams and you get to choose 3 of the 5 essay questions that you respond to. Yeah, you're exactly right, Mindy. Too many choices can lead to buyer's remorse. Yeah, limiting the choices is absolutely imperative when it comes to this. That idea of, again, treading the line of moderation with students. So before we wrap up, here are a few big important things to remember when it comes to encouraging our students to come to class prepared. First and foremost, you've got to stop lecturing over the reading. This is an easy trap to fall into for a lot of instructors for the reasons that I already talked about at the very beginning of this session, right? Our students haven't done the reading, so I need to make sure they know the material, so I'm going to talk about it in class. However, you've got to remember, if we use our class time to rehash the important content from the readings without adding to it in any meaningful way, then it follows that our students are just going to choose one over the other, right? They're going to choose coming to class or doing the reading. Because they're busy folks. They've got other things going on. They want to maximize their time while still succeeding in the course. So if they know that you're going to talk about it during class, they're not going to bother doing the reading because that's just redundant, right? That's a waste of time. So you've got to stop lecturing over the reading, but you also need to integrate the readings and homework during class in some way. Don't want to completely ignore the readings either, right? If you don't make them an integral part of the class, they'll undoubtedly perceive them as unnecessary. So you want to use your class time to build on them, clarify your course content. Readings should be linked to class activities, not just through accountability measures like quizzes, but in truly meaningful ways, whether it's through an application activity. Some of you guys talked about that already, discussion, reflection, writing, other strategies. P.S. Please tell me I have some Schitt's Creek fans in the audience today, because I was very pleased with myself for being able to work in a Schitt's Creek reference on this slide. And if you haven't watched it, you need to watch it because it's hilarious. You also want to consider the practical qualities of a text. The first step in getting students to read is for them to actually buy the book, right? To purchase the text. And some studies tell us that only approximately 20% of our students buy the books at all. So consider the cost when you're choosing your texts. At least make students aware of various places that they can buy it, online sites where it might be cheaper. You might allow them to purchase older editions of a text or select comparable texts that you think are just as valuable. In addition, perhaps instead of an expensive text, you could even just provide links to equally useful and free online articles. That's something that I've done in a class that I've taught recently, and students really appreciated not having to buy an expensive textbook. Beyond the cost of a text, you also think about kind of the organization of the textbook. Is it reader friendly? Is it easily navigable? As well as other pedagogical features. Oh, Dustin, most math texts range from $200 to $300. Oh, you have a Barnes & Noble contract. You can't give alternate places to buy it. That's frustrating. Well, something to think about, I guess. I guess you can't tell them, but I don't know. I'll have to think on that one. Kind of my last idea here in terms of practical qualities is revisiting the assumption that college courses must have a text. Sometimes we assign them simply because that's just what you do, but maybe it's not as necessary as we think, right? So it can be valuable to revisit that assumption if that's something that you think might be viable for you. And then finally, just make sure you're assigning a reasonable workload. We're often inclined to assign reading loads that are too heavy for our students' reading abilities, not just in terms of number of pages, but even just in terms of how hard it is to read that text. I can remember being an undergrad in a psychology class, and my professor gave us these really high-level scholarly articles from psychology journals to read. And it was really hard. And I know that I didn't read them the way that she wanted us to, just because I didn't know how. And I thought it was too much. A lot of scholars recommend this kind of less is more approach to determining course readings, with maybe even a list of fewer but more carefully chosen selections that won't paralyze students with the perception of an impossible workload. In the list of references that I sent you, there's a really interesting blog post about this by, I think, Stephen Volk, called Size Matters, How Much Reading to Assign and Other Imponderables. Again, it's just a blog post, but I think he makes some really interesting points in there. So as we come to the end of our time today, is there anything that you're now thinking about changing in your course design? Reading selections or assessment practices to help encourage better preparation from your students? Or do you have any other strategies that you might recommend that we haven't talked about today? Any thoughts? Peer pressure. Affirm that several of your strategies are good ones. That's great. Excellent. Okay, well, I think kind of my parting thought for you today is that, there are a lot of complex dynamics that are influencing our students' willingness and ability to read our assignments and prepare for our classes. But hopefully you're going to come away with some ideas today that will help you think about ways that are both extrinsically and intrinsically motivating for our students to prepare in the way that we want them to. So if you have any questions or ideas that you want to talk about later, please feel free to email me or call me or anything like that. I'm always glad to talk about these things with you. Oh, I see some things in the chat. I do a couple of things, including an oral quiz. Twice a week or 3 times a week classes. I give them a full week to participate when they want and earn little tokens. Oh, that's fun. Oh, that's a great idea. Thanks, Diana. That's great. Love that. Before you go, I just want to give you a quick reminder about some of our upcoming CTL webinars. We have the Stress and Self-Care series, second webinar next week about goal regulation as self-care. We've got some talks about critical thinking, trauma-informed instruction, imposter syndrome. We've got Dr. Rachel Gunter coming in to talk about using Perusall, and then meaningful online discussions later. Hopefully you'll be able to join me for more of those. Again, I'm here to help however I can, and I look forward to seeing all of you, hopefully, at some future sessions. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me at any time. And please be careful out there if we get some freezing rain later today. So stay warm and be safe.